Hello, and welcome back to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and we are outsmarting smart shapes again. We're looking at the slur settings one more time, and we're going to look at smart slur options. This is the third way that we can change our slurs, customize our slurs. So smart slur options, fourth option down on the smart shape menu, and we get this dialog box. Now, there's a lot going on in this dialog box, but we're going to look at the left hand first. And this use engraver slurs. If we uncheck this, you'll notice that all of these options on the left side get grayed out. Now, the engraver slurs was something that Finale added several versions ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe even longer. It's essentially the algorithm that helps slurs avoid elements in the score. There really is absolutely no reason to uncheck this. The only reason I can think of to uncheck this is if you're, upgrading an old file that didn't use the engraver slurs, and by having this checked, Finale recalculates those old slurs in a way that makes them not look good. You may want to uncheck those to bring them back to the way they're supposed to look based on your manual adjustments back in the day. That's the only reason I can think to have this unchecked. Otherwise, leave this checked and you'll be much happier with your slurs in general. Now, this whole left-hand side has to do with engraver slurs, and I'm actually going to start from the bottom section and work my way up. The initial adjustment. So when Finale looks to avoid elements from a slur, it's going to do one of two things first. It's going to either stretch the slur or it's going to lift the slur, depending on which of these two options you have. And whatever option you have checked, there's a maximum amount of it. So you have a maximum stretch here, which in this case can be as a percentage of the slur length, so 15% of the whole slur length, or it can be stretched a fixed amount, and the value here is you can set that as well. And with the lift, you have a maximum lift. Now, the lift is actually just, lifting the entire slur upwards, from the end points just straight up or straight down in that case. So what Finale is going to do to avoid elements in this case is it's going to stretch first, and it's only going to stretch 15% of the slur length. And then, if it's still not avoiding the elements, it's going to lift. So it will use the other one as the remaining way of avoiding the element. If I have lift chosen first, what Finale is going to do is it's going to lift the entire slur first to a maximum value of this value, 0.08333, and then it's going to stretch indefinitely until it finishes avoiding that element. All right, so initially out of the box, stretch is selected. And in the case of this slur here on the second bar, you can kind of see what happens is that, the slur got stretched about 15%. It still didn't avoid this stem, so then it just lifted the rest of the way. So it lifted this left side all the way up there until that slur got avoided, or until the slur avoided that stem, right? So if I choose the other option, let's choose lift first. Now again, it's just going to lift this amount and then it's going to stretch the rest of the way. This is how it's working. And we click OK. You'll see that the end of this slur got pushed downwards so that that maximum lift is achieved. It's not going to lift more than this amount. And then to avoid the stem, it stretched it the rest of the way, if that makes sense. So that's kind of how that works. And you have different options for how much you want to stretch or how much you want to lift first, depending on which one. And then it will do the other one the rest of the way. All right. And then working our way upwards, we have an option here for avoid accidentals. I would recommend leaving that checked. Otherwise, if you uncheck that, you're going to have situations like this where your slurs are going to be crossing your accidentals, which is not good. And the value here is just telling you how much space you want to leave around the accidental. 0.01 is not much. You can change that a little bit if you want. Let's say 0.025, and you get a little bit more daylight between your slur and your accidental there. And incidentally, just like all the other options in Smart Shape, there is a reset button here, and when you press that, it will reset all of these values back to the initial way that Finale has them set out of the box. So if I press reset here, you'll see that space around accidental get reset. And working our way upwards from there, space around objects. Now this is sort of a misnomer because object is a very narrowly defined word in this case. It's not avoiding things like expressions or articulations, although there is an articulation avoidance over here. The objects that it's referring to is literally just note heads, stems, and beams. Those are the objects as defined by space around object. And you can see in this case we have this second slur on the slur in the second measure here is the object it's avoiding is this stem. So if we change this space around object, make it a little higher, make it 0.12, what you'll see is a little bit more daylight in between the slur and the top of that stem, just like that, right? And if we go back, if we actually made that 0, you would see that it would just cross right at the top of that stem, which is not great. So that's what that is. And, essentially what's happening here is that Finale is looking at these two objects, space around object and space around accidentals. It's deciding how much space it needs to leave to avoid these things, and then it's using these initial adjustments and the secondary adjustment to avoid those objects, right? So it's saying I need 0.0625 space around the stem. So I'm going to stretch first a maximum of 15% of the length, and then I'm going to lift the rest of the way. So you can sort of see how all of these things sort of work together, okay? And then slur symmetry percentage. Now this is a little bit more relative when you have slurs with flat baselines. Now that essentially means that the beginning and ending point are sort of on the same horizontal plane, like they are on these two slurs right here. And what this percentage is that it will tell Finale how much symmetry to retain with the slur when you need to make adjustments like a stretching and all that kind of stuff. So if you were to put this at 100%, essentially this slur is going to get drawn precisely symmetrical, right? Which is not necessarily always the case. And if we change this actually to 0%, meaning you don't really care about the symmetry of it, you can see the result is that it becomes a lot less symmetrical. It's definitely sort of a steeper arc on the right side here, particularly on this one, right? You kind of see how that works like that. Let me just reset all of this. And so 85% is what it has set, but if you don't care about the symmetry so much, maybe you can change that to 70, 75% to get slightly different results, all right? And then finally, in the Engraver Slurs option, let's look at what maximum slur angle in degrees means. Now this has to do with the baseline angle, and it comes into play with situations like this. Now you'll notice that the slurs in this case, the right-hand side of the slur is sort of attached to where it should be above the right-hand note, but on the left one, it's not. And the reason why is because that setting, which says the maximum slur angle in degrees is 45 degrees. So if I were to draw a line along the baseline of this slur, that line would be 45 degrees. If I were to increase this, now this can be any number between 0 and 90, I think. If I were to increase this to like 85, you'll see that now Finale is allowing me to create a much steeper slur and to get a result like that, all right? And then obviously if I were to put this at 0, you'll see that Finale is going to make these slurs completely horizontal, right? It's not allowing that slur to be on an angle at all, right? So 45 is the default option. If you want to allow a little bit steeper, maybe set it to 60 or something, so it'll get a little bit closer in this particular case. Anytime you're making adjustments like these, though, you do have to be careful because you could make one adjustment that looks good on a couple of slurs, and then later on realize that it does not look great everywhere else. So, use all of these options with care as you're going. All right. So that is essentially the Engraver Slurs part of the side of that window. So let's look at the second half of that window. So go back here, and we're going to start talking about slur avoidance. And now I talked about slur avoidance a little bit when I talked about articulations, because articulations is the only thing in this category. In video 13-3C, I believe, there's a little bit of an extensive discussion about it there. But essentially what this is the articulations will avoid slurs that are set to avoid slurs. Some articulations can be set to ignore slurs. But for the ones that are set to avoid slurs, this is the amount that the articulation will avoid the slur by, in this case 0.02778. Now this does have some implications because slurs will sometimes flip around. In fact, if I, hold on a second, if I just change this slur around a little bit, you can kind of see how the articulations will jump up and down depending on where the slur is. But if we change that number to a higher amount, it will also affect where that accent is, because it needs to avoid it by more than what it had been with this particular accent being below. So again, check out 13-3C for a little bit more in depth about that particular option, because it does relate more to the articulations than just right here. All right. And then slur system breaks. Now this is going to be your settings for what happens with the slur at a system break, and I have a couple of them set up here. And you can see that the slur will sort of go to this point and then stop. So those settings here will affect exactly where it stops. And the avoid staff lines by at least value is the vertical value, essentially. And so right now it's set to 0.02778, but if we make this really high, 0.5, you can see how high it gets. And you notice that the upper one goes up and the lower one goes down. So these values are not absolute. Positive numbers go away and negative numbers go towards the staff lines in this case, all right? And the other two values, system start adjust and system end adjustment, these are horizontal values. So for the end adjustment, you can see that it's set to 0, which means that the end of the slur is exactly the end of the bar there. But if we were to make that a negative number, you'll see that it will go left, right? And if we make that a positive number, it will go the other way. It will go right of the system. So it just depends on how you want to see that. Obviously, that's a very great value to put in there, but I think 0 is generally fine. And then the other number will affect where the slur starts on the next system. So in this case, it's set to negative 0.02778. So it's sort of putting it just left of where that system officially starts according to Finale. If we put it at 0, you'll see it's not that much different. But let's say we can put this at 0.5, and you'll see that it goes to the right, because again, these values are positive to the right and negative to the left, regardless of whether it's the beginning of the system or the end of the system. All right, so that's what those numbers will do, so you can kind of adjust those as you need to. And let's talk about thickness and slur tip. All right, hold on, let me just show you some of these slurs up here. Now, the thickness is interesting. There's a horizontal and a vertical value for the left and right side of the thickness of the slur. Now, the thing to understand about slurs is that the way that Finale thinks about them is that there's a lower slur, or a lower curve, and an upper curve, and they sort of make the two sides of the slur, and then it fills in the space in between with the line, right? Essentially, the vertical height will dictate the space between the upper and lower curve. And there's left side and right side. So you can actually have different numbers on the left side and right side to create unbalanced looking slurs. So actually, if I were to change the vertical on the left side from 0.02 to 0.05, you'll see that the left side of the slur gets a little thicker than the right side of the slur, right? And if I were to change it, let's reset. If I were to change this to 0.06 on the right, you'll see that the opposite happens. The right side is now thicker than the left side. Now, the horizontal values here, this is where it gets confusing, even for me. But essentially, the horizontal values is the horizontal thickness values of the left and right is sort of what dictates how much the slur tapers at the end. And currently it's set to 0. But if you change these numbers around a little bit to, let's say 0.1, you'll notice that it gets really thick at the left and then tapers very quickly to the end right here. It's kind of hard to see, but that's kind of what's happening. And interestingly, in order to get the same result on the right, you have to add you have to put a negative number in here, so negative 0.1, to get the same result on the right. Right, and when you do things like this, you do get some weird results because now the left side of the slur is much thicker than the middle of the slur, which is not a great looking slur at all. All right, but you can play around with these, and actually, let me show you one more thing about the tip width. Now, that's exactly what you think it means. When it's 0, essentially that slur is coming down to a point of infinite non-existence, I guess you'd say. But if we make this a positive number a little bit, we can make the end of that slur a little bit thicker. And be careful here, you want to use really, really small numbers. So I'm going to use 0.005 here. And you'll see just very subtly, you'll see the end of the slur now has a little bit of thickness, right? So it's got a little bit more girth to it. Actually, if I go back to reset that. So you can sort of see the difference where it just kind of goes into nothingness versus having a little girth there. 0.005 will give you a little bit of a more definitive end to the slur in a lot of ways. Now, what's cool about the thickness and the slur tip options here is that you can actually create unbalanced looking slurs, which are interesting because if you're using a hand-drawn font in Finale, you could also make your slurs look hand-drawn. And I'm actually going to give you a few numbers to fit in here because I kind of was playing around with this before. And so use these numbers to get a little hand-drawn looking slur. So I'm going to put 0.03 in the left thickness horizontal. I'm going to put 0.5 in the vertical on the left. The thickness on the right, what do I got here? Negative 0.015. And vertical right, we're going to put 0.01. And for my tip width, I'm going to put 0.006. All right, now you see that all these numbers are sort of imbalanced in a lot of ways. But the result is if you look at that, you kind of have a little like hand-drawn calligraphy kind of slur, which looks kind of, looks silly with this particular music font. But you can see if you're using the jazz font or the Broadway copyist font, that could be a neat little thing to do. And that's just one way to do that. You can play with those numbers a little bit to get your own spin on that hand-drawn look. But that's how you would do that. And incidentally, I did some research on this, and Finale is the only program that allows you to do this. Sibelius and Dorico both will not allow you to create a slur that looks hand-drawn like this, right? In both of those programs, you can control the slur thickness, but it's completely symmetrical, so there's no way to actually get a result like this. So there you go, Finale +1 for uniqueness in this particular regard, if you ever need to do a hand-drawn slur. All right. And finally, let's talk about this last option here. Tips avoid staff lines by, and there's a value here. And hold on, let me just reset my slurs here so we can sort of see this normally. Now, essentially what this option does, it will prevent Finale from putting the end of the slur right on a staff line. This will sort of play in concert with the smart shape placement for slurs, because there is a value in the vertical for all of these slur positionings that will place the tip of the slur away from the note. However, if the position that it puts it is too close to a line, then this option will take over and it will say, all right, well, the placement puts it too close to that line, less than this value of 0.2778. So what it will do is it will flip the end of the slur to above the next line so that it doesn't get too close to the line, if that makes sense. It's a little confusing, but essentially you want to have this checked, and you want to have some sort of value here so that the placement of the end of the slur doesn't put the tip of the slur on a line. If it does, then it will take this number into account, and it will move the tip of that slur to above or to below the next line that it's close to, if that makes sense. All right. And then finally, I mentioned this a little bit in the previous video, but I did want to point out that all of these options will affect not only the slur, but the dashed slur and the dashed curve tool as well, right? The bend hat, like I mentioned, will also be affected by the slur placement. The bend hat will not be affected by any of these smart slur options, right? So this is only specific to slurs, or those three slurs essentially. For the dashed curve specifically, all of these options in the smart slur options will take effect except for the ones having to do with thickness and slur tip. And that's because the dashed curve tool has no taper, and so these particular settings will not apply to the dashed curve tool. Nor will any of these settings apply to the thickness for the bend hat, right? For the thickness of those two tools, we do have to go into the Smart Shapes options, and the bottom right settings here is will affect those particular tools. And then finally, just to point out that some of these options we can ignore if we right click. We have engraver slurs, which we can turn on or off if we right click on a handle, and as well as the options to avoid accidentals. So if for some reason you want to have the slur not avoid the accidental, you can just turn that off. And essentially what that's doing is it's overriding that particular aspect for this particular slur, right? And same thing with engraver slurs. We can actually turn the engraver slurs off for this particular slur, which in this case will actually do the same thing as not avoiding the accidentals. So that covers it. That's the Smart Slur options. Like I said, there's a lot to it. There's a lot to slurs in Finale, as you can see in these over the course of these two videos. So I hope that I've explained it well. Like I said, there's a lot to cover, and it does get a little complicated, but hopefully it makes a little bit more sense now. So thanks for watching, and come back and we'll start looking at the settings for some other elements coming up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.